Okay, so in this video we're going to create our first simple game. Instantiate means make a copy of, essentially. So we have one cube in our scene and we're going to add some code in here that duplicates that cube using a for loop. The second thing we're going to do is add some standard assets into the scene so we can create a car that can drive through and interact with all of the cubes that have been instantiated into the scene. So you need to start with your main camera in the scene, a directional light which should come in automatically, a cube which I've added a red material to, and a plane which I've added a yellow material to. So the first thing that we're going to do is just increase the size of our plane, because as our cube instantiates we need a floor for those so that they don't just fall into space. So we can click on the plane and look at our transform component in our inspector, and we're going to transform it on the X by 50. And we're going to transform it on the Z by 50. You can see now that we have our cube sitting right in the middle of a rather large plane. It's important to point out at this point, if you find that your cube is sitting off to the side or if your plane is nowhere near your cube, we can come in here to our transform component and just change the position of those all the way back to 0 for the X, Y, and Z axes. And for our cube, we can also place that at 0 on our X, Y, and Z axes. When I scroll into my cube, though, you can see that that positions the cube in the middle of the floor. So we might just want to bring it up on the Y axis by 1, so it's hovering just above our plane. So in our project window, we're going to click on our scripts folder, and we're going to create a new C# script. We're going to call this C# script cube explode. The first piece of script, that we're going to use here is to instantiate 300 cubes into the scene. Now those cubes will all appear at the same place. With physics, that's impossible. You can't have that many cubes sitting in one place. So what will happen is they will burst out from each other and fly all over our world, our game world. So we're going to double click on our C# script to open it up and we'll start typing. Now the IDE that my computer is defaulting to is Visual Studio, the community version. It usually, especially if you're using older versions of Unity, will default to monodevelop. It doesn't matter at this point, any IDE will work, so long as it does generate your standard codes for you. So we want to make sure that we have our systems collections, our systems generic, and our Unity engine set at the top. We have a public class, and it should have put in the name of your class to match the name of the script. If these two don't match, your script won't work. We also default to having our start function and our update function included in our script. For this particular script, we're not going to use our update function. We only want this script to run once when the game is first initialized. So we can remove the void update script function. And we have our open class bracket, our open start function bracket, our close start function bracket, and then we close our public class at the very end. So the first thing that we need to do is create a variable that's going to hold our game object of the cube, so the script knows what game object it's actually instantiating. So we want to be able to see that in the inspector, which means it's a public class. The type of variable is a game object. We're then going to give it a name. I'm going to call it cube because that just makes sense. And then I'm going to put a semicolon. I'm not going to give this variable a value at this point because we're going to set the value in the inspector later on. We then can come into our start function and we're going to create a simple line of code which is in Instantiate. And inside the brackets, we're going to tell it what it's actually instantiating. So this is going to instantiate our cube. So I write the word cube in there. Now, if I was to run this script at this point, it would instantiate one cube when the game initialized. So we would end up with 2 cubes. I would like about 300 cubes to instantiate into my scene. So in order for it to do that, I need to create a for loop so that this line of code will iterate and repeat itself 300 times very, very quickly. So what we can do now is start our for loop. We're going to create an integer variable called I, and we're going to start that at 0. We're then going to say for as long as I is less than 300, iterate through the for loop, and then we put the for loop action inside brackets. So essentially we have for, as long as integer I is equal to 0, so long as I is less than 300, run the following line of code and add 1 to I. So this is going to say, yes, 0 is less than 300, instantiate the cube, change this to 1. 1 is still less than 300, instantiate the cube, add 1 to I. 2, and it's going to do that until this becomes 300. And then it's going to say, is I less than 300? No, and the loop will stop. It's very important that we make sure that our exit condition in our loop will eventually become false, otherwise our computer will crash. The RAM will fill up and the computer will crash. I'm going to save this script and come back into my Unity software, and I can now add that script onto the main camera in my scene, and we can see down here my cube explode script is now added to my main camera game object. We can also see the variable that I've created called cube, and you'll see at the moment that it has no value because we didn't set a value in the script itself. So what I can do now is tell it what game object I want my cube variable to be. Clicking on the little circle, it gives me all of the game objects in my scene, and I can choose cube. It now knows that when it's running that instantiate code, this is the game object that needs to be instantiated. If I press play now, okay, our game's playing and we don't see any cubes exploding. If I don't maximize on play, we can see here though that it is actually cloning 300 different cubes. So our script is actually working, but at the moment it's cloning 300 cubes on top of each other. The reason they're not exploding is at the moment our cube doesn't have any physics on it, so it's not a solid object. In order to rectify this, we need to click on our cube game object in our hierarchy, and we're going to add a physics component to it using the inspector. Okay, so the way that we can do that is add component. We can come down to physics and we find rigid body. You can see now that we have this rigid body component on our cube object. It has a mass, it has drag, it uses gravity, it has the basic settings for physics on it. So now this is a solid cube that will fall to the ground. It won't just float in the air, and it won't be able to sit in the same place as another cube without kind of reacting to that other shape or that other object. So now when I press play, we can see that those cubes now explode out from each other and are placed throughout our world. Okay, so that's the starting point of our game. We have a large plane and we have a game object in it called cube that will explode out and fill our world with lots of different types of cubes.